Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening. I'm your host, Steve Taylor. What you're about to hear is a chapter from Waking Nightmare, a collaborative, interactive, serialized horror saga presented to you by Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Each chapter of this series is written week by all of you, our listeners, and only you can tell us how the story unfolds. At the conclusion of today's chapter, those of you in the audience will be asked to help write the next chapter in the saga and to participate by posting it as a comment on this very video. After a week of voting, the chapter with the most upvotes will become canon and will be adapted to audio as the next official installment of the series. Without further ado, settle in, get cozy, and brace yourself. You're about to experience one-of-a-kind horror storytelling in the form of a waking nightmare.
The man fell to his knees, cold sweat dripping from his brow, and a deep, throbbing pain radiating from his throat. Why? Why was he in so much pain? That's right. He had forgotten. He had been screaming. But what was he screaming at? Something? No, that wasn't right. He had been screaming for something. For someone. For anyone. The man thumped his closed fist against his temple, as if trying to beat the memories back into his skull. He beseeched the empty air as a priest would his silent gods.
Why can't I remember?
The man let out a grunt of frustration and slammed his fist against the tree to his right. Wait, no, not a tree. There was no rough texture. The surface was smooth. He had hit a wall.
Yes, that's right. The forest was last time. Or was it the time before that?
It was all so hard to remember. He looked around, taking in his surroundings. It was a strange place. He stood in a long, narrow hallway, its walls decorated with patterns of such intrinsic complexity that merely looking upon them brought feelings of nausea. To his left were small, circular windows. As he looked outside them, he could see a large body of water that stretched out as far as the eye could see. In the distance, he spotted the sun. He caught just one glimpse of its light before the ocean seemed to swallow it whole, leaving nothing behind but the inky blackness of the night. Though he did not know why, a single crystalline tear slid down his cheek as he bore witness to the dying of the light. Feeling that he had seen enough of the outside for the moment, he wiped his eyes and decided to focus his attention back on the interior of the boat? No, that wasn't right. It was too large to be a boat. Ship? Yes. Well, it looked like one anyways. But there was something off about the place. The colors were faded, and the sound was practically non-existent, save for the faint echo of his footsteps, the soft hum of the lights, and the heavy beating of his heart. Why was his heart beating so fast? The man racked his brain, searching for the word. Then it came to him like a whisper on the wind. Fear. It was fear he felt, but he couldn't recall why. The deep-seated anxiety in his chest was nearly suffocating in its intensity. He was on a knife's edge, needing only the slightest push to send him into a fit of panic. His confusion and memory loss did not help matters.
Where am I? Who am I?
The questions echoed in his mind, an incessant rattle that was at once maddening and comforting. as the old saying goes. I think, therefore I am. That was the saying. He was certain of it. It would have to do. He took a moment to compose himself before he pressed on with the intent of exploring the rest of the ship. It was a large place, filled with several more hallways and rooms, most of which were locked. The few that were open to him seemed to be bedrooms, complete with furnishings that one would expect to find in a 5-star hotel. In each of the rooms, there was a bed, television, and bathroom. In each and every, he'd enter and turn on the television. But it was always the same. Nothing but the snowy image of static greeted him. He shut his eyes and gritted his teeth as he listened to the constant sound of static for the umpteenth time. Then, he hoisted the TV up and hurled it across the room, shattering its screen against the wall. The static did not cease. In fact, it only grew louder, its sound slowly increasing in volume until it turned into an all-consuming screech.
Make it stop!
He covered his ears and screamed in protest, desperately trying to keep the horrid sound at bay. His efforts failed. The screech became more and more intense by the second. It grew sharper and louder with each passing moment, drowning out the man's wails of pain. The lights around him began to flicker, and the shadows they cast seemed to be closing in on him as a predator would their cornered prey. Then, suddenly, the noise stopped, leaving behind an amplified silence. The lights returned to normal, and the shadows returned to their usual form. The man looked around the room, completely dumbfounded by what had just happened. He began to question his very sanity.
This can't be happening. It can't be. It just can't be.
Then he noticed an irritating sensation whenever the fabric of his shirt brushed against the skin of his right arm. It felt like it was covered in fire ants. He raised it into the light so as to get a better look. That's when he noticed the blood.
Damn.
With a curse, he made his way to the restroom, turned on the grey light and yanked up his shirt sleeve. Then he saw why he was bleeding. There, etched into his skin, was a message. But it was no ordinary wound, where one would expect to find perhaps some ghastly reminder of some unfortunate accident, was instead evidence of the injury being self-inflicted. The proof was in the message the wound conveyed. There, carved into his very epidermis, were the words, "Don't die. Don't sleep." The man yanked up his other sleeve, looked at his other arm and saw a long, deep incision that stretched lengthwise along his veins.
I did this to myself?
He looked into the mirror above the sink and saw more. So much more. His face was a mess of scarred tissue, a veritable patchwork puzzle of burns and cuts that showed a picture of pure hatred. Hatred against him. Who would do this to him? And why? He would not, could not believe that he'd do such things to himself. So somebody else had to have done it. He touched his throat, felt the thick, smooth skin that ran across his jugular. He tore open his shirt and beheld several more scars decorating his body. A few showed signs of being self-inflicted. Others did not. All across his skin, he could see reminders of the horrors he'd been put through. He saw evidence of fatal knife and gunshot wounds. These, while unpleasant to see, were far from the most disturbing things he noticed. Upon the left-hand side of his torso were what appeared to be teeth marks. But they were teeth unlike that of any creature he knew of. The very size and unnatural shape of the scar made him shiver at the very thought of the pain such a wound would have inflicted. For once, he was almost grateful for his loss of memory. This went on for several minutes, him examining his body, and and every second bringing a new, horrifying revelation of the unspeakable things that had been done to him. Each and every scar breathed life into the faint embers that had been his memories. Fleeting images, sounds and sensations came to him with every new wound he discovered. The gnashing of teeth, the tearing of sinew, the screams of pure agony. Then, just as quickly as the flashes came, they were gone again. He collapsed to the floor, clutching his head in his hands, the heavy beating of his heart pounding in his ears like a heavy drum. He finally understood why he was afraid, and with that understanding came a terror far greater than the one that had come before.
I should be dead.
It was true. He should have died 100 times over if he'd suffered those kinds of wounds. And yet, he lived. He raised his dark arm back into the light. Don't die. Don't sleep. They were simple instructions, ones that now carried far more weight. Even so, he didn't fully understand them. Don't die was clear enough. But don't sleep? Why? What harm could sleep bring? He lay there for some time, questions running through his head, trying to will his memories back to understand just what was happening to him and why. The place in which he found himself, the vessel, was not normal. That much he knew. The ship, the scars, the horrible memories. He wanted answers. He needed answers. Yet, they did not come. Eventually, he rose from the floor and left the room. He stepped back into the hallway and saw something new. The area he came upon was not illuminated. It was so dark, in fact, that he couldn't make out a single detail. It seemed to him to be a place of pure darkness. His heart sank as he gazed upon it. It appeared so endless and so cold. He did not want to go in there. He turned his back on the abyss and faced the light ahead of him. While it gave him some small measure of comfort, he could not help but feel like the void itself was watching him somehow. But even so, he could not bear the idea of looking back at it. There was no telling what he might see. The man continued to explore the craft, but it was always the same. Every room was identical in every way to the one before it. It didn't matter how far he walked. There seemed to be no end to the accursed hallway. He mulled over his situation.
Is this all some sort of dream?
He cast a glance at his arm, his eyes tracing the letters carved into it. It felt real enough.
How can this be? How can any of this be real?
But the thing that really disturbed him was how the darkness seemed to follow him. Though he dared not look back, he could hear the faint buzz of the lights fade away shortly after stepping beyond them. It reminded him of the final sound a cicada makes just before it dies. He gave up on searching the guest rooms. There was no point. It was the same. It would always be the same. All he could do was move forward and wish, pray, for salvation. And so he did. For hours he wandered the accursed ship, following the maze-like path of the seemingly endless hallways until he collapsed once again out of pure exhaustion. He could go no further. He was tired. His back and feet ached. Once more he raised his left arm into the light and reviewed again the warning he had left for himself.
Don't sleep. Don't die.
The man knew he shouldn't sleep. He knew that, but what other choice was there? To keep moving? To endlessly wander the damn place like a slack-jawed automaton? He allowed himself a moment of rest and slumped against the wall.
No. I will not. I just want to sleep. Please. Just let me sleep.
Before he could finish the thought, he saw it. A doorway. But it was no ordinary doorway. The jewel doors were of a single color, whereas everything else before it had been grey, and to top it all off, they were red. Everything else around him was so dull and lifeless, but the doors were red, and they were beautiful. He felt the stirrings of something in his heart, something else he had forgotten. Hope. Without a moment's hesitation, he bounded toward the doorway, passing the cold, lifeless surroundings that, up until that point, had been his entire world. The doors were more than simple chunks of wood to him. In his mind, they represented something he wanted so much that it physically hurt. Change. Before long, he was there. He stood before the doors, their crimson hue enthralling him, calling to him their unparalleled beauty. But upon his approach, he noticed a message scrawled across the doors in gold letters. Lasciate ogni speranza. Voci entrate. He did not know what the message meant, as he could not understand the language. But what did it matter? What was on the other side was irrelevant. It had to be better than what he'd been through already. Besides, he could still feel the darkness closing in on him. The entire time, he never once turned back to look at it. He didn't have to. He could feel its chill as it inched closer and closer to him, and he would be damned before he'd let it take him. He pushed at the doors with all of his might, and he fell into the next room. With a heavy groan, the door shut behind him. He clambered back to his feet and gazed upon his surroundings. And what he saw was glorious, breathtaking, impossibly massive in size and beautiful beyond all measure. He was in a ballroom, but it was unlike any that one would expect to find. He found himself surrounded by gold. The tables, chairs, the very floor he stood on were made of pure gold. In the center of the room was a spiral staircase that extended to incredible heights. Above him hung a chandelier that seemed to be made of light itself, mysteriously suspended in the air without any kind of wire or rope supporting it. It was as if someone had plucked a star from the sky and decided to put it on display. It truly was a sight to behold. Music floated through the air. Where it came from, he did not know, but its beautiful notes added to the man's sense of wonder. The music served to calm him further. It was melancholy in nature, yet peaceful. A name came to him. Beethoven. Moonlight Sonata. The memory came without a thought or effort. In it, he was seated in an easy chair, near the fire, listening to the classics. He had a love for music such as this, always had and always would. The man smiled at the memory, basking in his newfound peace. It was not to last. The music began to slowly distort, twisting into a demented version of itself. In his peripherals, he could see shadows waxing, waning, and growing. He turned back to the door and saw it immediately. The darkness had returned. It was seeping through the edges like oil. It crawled along the walls and floor, melding with the shadows cast by the star above. In an instant, the air began to grow colder and weigh him down. As the spreading corruption engulfed all in its path, the man fell and scrambled backwards, desperately trying to escape. It was no use. Before he knew it, the darkness had consumed everything before him and was now mere inches away. He didn't know what else to do, so he did the only thing he could think of. He shut his eyes. Too terrified to face the abyss, he squeezed his eyes shut and waited for the end. He could feel its cold embrace as it surrounded him. Then, everything stopped. All sound ceased. The music stopped. At first, he was grateful for the silence, until he realized it was all that was left, aside from the sound of his shallow breathing. With the loss of the music, the reality of his situation truly began to sink in. He was alone and afraid in the dark, with nothing but his thoughts to keep him company.
This isn't happening. It can't be happening. Can't be happening. Can't be happening.
He repeated the words like a prayer, even as the all-consuming cold numbed his fingers and reduced his breath to foam. He did so until the sound of footsteps pulled him from his reverie. Instinctively, he opened his eyes so as to identify the source of the sound. He immediately regretted doing so. He saw things in the dark. Impossibly tall creatures with gangly limbs and crooked faces. Their eyes were nothing more than holes that seemed to somehow hold a void deeper and darker than their surroundings. They stared at him silently, never moving, never breathing, only staring. They had him surrounded, and there were so many of them. Too many to count. The man cowered at the sight, shrinking to try and remove himself from their presence as best he could. He was terrified beyond all measure, more than ever before. He wasn't even afraid that he was going to die. He was afraid of the alternative. He was afraid of what the things had in store for him. Then he whimpered a single word.
Please. Please.
This seemed to please the creatures, as their crooked mouths twisted into hideous smiles that only intensified his fear. Slowly, silently, the mob divided itself, exposing the large doors he'd used when he initially entered the room. Unlike before, they were now open, and what he saw chilled him to his very core. His brain lurched, unable to comprehend, much less accept, what he was seeing. At times it resembled a wolf, only much larger and twisted in nature. At others, its form was simply incomprehensible. Demon. Demon was the only word that came to mind when he saw the creature. The sounds it made, words could not describe. However, its teeth were its most disturbing feature by far. He recognized them. More memories of ripping and tearing flashed through his mind. It was at that moment he knew. The creature before him was the one who hurt him, and crept slowly towards him. Its heavy footsteps echoing in the massive room. Its eyes locked on his, seemingly daring him to run. And so, he did. With the speed of hunted prey, the man turned and ran further into the darkness. With an ungodly roar, the demon gave chase. The beast tore through the tables and chairs with alarming speed. The man had never imagined such a big thing could move so quickly. He ran. He ran until his legs burned and his veins pumped acid, and still he kept on running. He could not let the monstrous thing catch him. No matter how much his body protested, he knew whatever pain he felt in that moment was nothing compared to what he was about to do to him. Somehow, he knew this from experience. As he ran from the creature, memories of their past encounters flooded his mind. The breaking, tearing, and chewing. Its demented laughter in response to his cries for mercy. He always ran from it, and it always caught him. Now he ran again, hoping and praying that he'd find some way to escape this time.
Please, God.
God? There is no God. There is only you and me, together forever.
His voice was twisted, inhuman. The man wept as he ran. He knew it to be true, but there was no escape. He'd finally realized the futility of running. He was ready to give up, to allow the demon to have its way. That's when he saw it. The staircase from before. There it was, shrouded in darkness and cold, stretching to infinity. If there was a way out, that was his best chance. With one last desperate burst of energy, he charged towards his imagined salvation. The demon, seemingly unaware of the man's intention, picked up speed, determined to prevent his prey's escape. As soon as he reached the stairway, he dove between the railing and the steps, crashing into their jagged edges. He heard a wet snap. The right side of his chest burst into pain. He cried out, but pushed through it and began to climb the stairs. The beast crashed into the railing, becoming twisted and tangled in its metal wires. The whole structure shook intensely, so much so that the man began to fear its collapse. Yet, it held. The demon thrashed against its bindings. Not wanting to waste any time, the man continued to climb the stairs, eager to put as much space between him and the creature as possible. The monster continued to struggle against its confines. Then, it spoke.
Go on then, run! I will find you. Already I can taste your blood.
The man continued to climb the stairs. He ascended farther and further until even the beast's wild howls began to fade into silence. Soon, he was alone again. Nothing but the cold dark and the pain in his side to keep him company. But even so, he continued his endless ascent, climbing higher and higher. Before long, he began to lose hope of ever leaving the dark behind. Just then, he spied a faint glow above him. At first, he didn't believe it, chalking it up as another trick of the mind. But no, what began as a speck grew larger as he approached. Before long, it bloomed into a night sky full of stars. At last, he approached the top of the stairs. As he stepped out onto solid ground again, he allowed himself a small measure of relief. He looked around and realized that he was on the deck of the ship, though it was too shrouded in darkness. The atmosphere felt far less heavy. Its weight felt far more natural than that which he had left behind. He looked up and saw streaks of light dance across the night sky. They were beautiful, and the temptation to lose himself in their beauty was present. But by that point, he had become far more cautious than he ever had been before. Nothing about the vessel was as it seemed, and he would not allow himself to be tricked so easily again. He took the time to explore the deck, taking in its surroundings. Other than the stairway he left behind, there seemed to be no other entrance into the ship. He peered over the edge and saw the bottom half of the ship. It extended so far down that he could scarcely make out where it ended. Were it not for the slight illumination of the starry sky, he doubted that he'd be able to see the end at all. Finally, he made his way to the very front of the ship and turned upon the horizon. Past the water and through the mist, he could make out the silhouette of a skyline in the distance. However, where one would expect to see lights from windows and cars, he was instead greeted by the sight of a city burning. Great pillars of smoke rose high into the night sky. Ash began to fall on the deck like leaves from a tree. A gust of wind brought with it the stench of fire, and of death, and of the screams of the damned. His journey was far from over.
Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm your host, Steve Taylor, and you've been listening to Waking Nightmare, a collaborative, interactive, serialized horror saga presented to you by Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Who decides where the story goes next? You do. That's right, you. Every chapter of this story will be written by those of you in our listening audience, and every week, someone else has a chance to win. To submit the next chapter, simply write it and then submit it as a comment on this very video with the word chapter and the chapter number on your first line. The limit on the length of the YouTube comment is currently 9,500 characters, or about 1,866 words. To ensure your chapter is submitted successfully, be sure not to exceed these limits. If your comment posts successfully, you may consider your chapter accepted, and it will be considered for production and can be voted upon immediately by the viewing audience. Voting will go for 1 week, and after that point, the submission with the most upvotes will be declared the winner and will be adapted to audio as the next official chapter in the series. A word of caution: entries which have been edited after their initial posting will be deemed ineligible, so be sure to double-check your work before posting. If changes are needed after you've submitted your work, you will need to delete your original comment and repost it from scratch. And if your chapter doesn't turn heads 1 week, don't get discouraged. Each chapter will present another opportunity for you to determine where the story goes, and another chance to have your installment selected by the audience. Thank you all for listening and for participating in The Waking Nightmare. We look forward to seeing where you make this story go. Until next time, I'm your host, Steve Taylor, inviting you to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.